Hello and welcome. Uh, Good morning, Yang Gang. My name is Tada or Taddy. I'm a psychotherapist, and social justice advocate. Support and follow Andrew Yang, especially having being introduced to universal basic income and human-centered economics through his campaign, and so I've been following for a while, and yeah, I'd love to contribute some content. Uh, and today I'd love to talk a little bit about the subject of war. And to be honest, it's not a subject that I'm not like a foreign policy, like huge follower of, all the details of what's going on. But we know that there's been, fears raised, especially with Trump's attacks on as I understand, a general in Iran. And I want to give a little bit of perspective of how, you know, somebody like Andrew Yang might, based on his outlook on the world, might deal with things and what he might offer. And so, yeah, the brazen title is Andrew Yang will, or something like, end the forever wars inside and outside. So something I want to mention is Andrew Yang's approach to war. You know, is actually really about inside out. And this actually kind of really shows up in the fact that his book is called The War on Normal People. So he is talking really about the war internally inside of America on its civilians. And I think that's a really compelling way to look at war. And he has also said actually that our strength inside is what leads to our well-being and our relationships outside, which is, when you think about our lives as individuals, that's also true. When we are at war in ourselves, we have trouble in our relationships with people out there. And so I want to talk a little bit what's the war inside, and in terms of when you look at I guess like government and policy and stuff. So the thing that really you see that Andrew is looking at dismantling with a lot of his policy is you hear about a lot of his talk about dismantling GDP as a measure for well-being of an economy. So one of the things that's really interesting, I learned about GDP through kind of following Andrew, and then I think I read Rutger Bregman's Utopia for Realists is kind of where I think I picked this up, is that GDP is actually, or its predecessor GNP, I guess, is really picking up after a wartime economy. So it was really put in place to fuel the military industrial complex. So like when you build tanks and things like that, GDP goes up, right? And I think that is a really interesting way to understand that the global economy, ever since I think World War One, somewhere around that time, not that there wasn't war before, but around World War One, has been operating in a wartime economy that's driven by GDP growth, right? And that's actually a really fascinating concept to think about, because a lot of the parts of the world, might have relative peace, but they're still operating at GDP. So they are operating with the kind of economic measurements that are driving war. And you can imagine that has cyclical relationship, because if you're always chasing GDP growth, you are in a war economy essentially, and still behaving that way. So you're going to end up creating conflicts just because you are in that cycle of growth. And this is very similar to how human beings operate. So let's say that you're in a conflict, right? This is something human beings experience. So let's say you're in like a big conflict, and at that time, the amount of stress from that conflict is too much to handle for your body. And what happens is that your body stores that information and energy as what we call trauma. And then, that's what PTSD really is. So when that happens, though, is that you might not outwardly be expressing this response, something called a fight response. A fight response is that when you get threatened, you punch back, and it's not always literally. It can be through like, let's say, you might sue somebody or say mean things about them, but it's a fight response, the body's response to aggress on a threat, right? And this response, it doesn't have to be like completely out on the surface. It could happen at a latent subconscious level that people don't realize. So people don't realize they're even being aggressive to each other, even necessarily. A lot of passive aggression is actually this kind of fight response driven by PTSD, but it's kind of suppressed, so you don't actually see it, but it's kind of underneath. And so just like how we go through that as individuals, whole nations as kind of entities do the same thing. And that's my observation, actually, as a psychotherapist who works with, social justice, so with like larger political movements. You see that it's not just individuals that can have these traumatic responses. You can have whole, a bit larger collective entities that exhibit very similar behavior. And so GDP growth, chasing that, from my observation, is a real emblem of this kind of perpetuation of this traumatic PTSD response in an economy. And it's really interesting when you follow Andrew talk. He also talks about other things that are related to war economies. Like, let's say, for example, kind of bringing down the importance of SAT, so standardized testing. So standardized testing, what I learned from him, was developed really to separate the kids you want to send to the front lines and kids you want to leave back. So maybe the kids who are smart enough, they're assets, and they're not going to send them to the front lines. Like, that's really, really fucking grim. But a lot of countries around the world, follow standardized tests still. I'm from Japan, and that's like a huge part of our culture, so. And, the Japanese economy is definitely a war economy. And so, again, in the United States, you have a war economy driving the lives of people every day. And so, like, going through school, going through the job market, all of that is a war. And actually, when you start to understand that, you see the larger scaffolding of the war on normal people. And the thing is, you can't end the forever wars outside of your country until you stop the forever wars inside of your country. And human-centered capitalism, when you're talking about stuff like reshifting the economy from this war-oriented economy to something that is a lot more sustainable, long-term, looks after the individual well-being. You might also, add like universal basic income, stops the war in terms of like that kind of like survival that people are going through all the time to get ahead in life. That ending that war, in forever war inside the country, can it's completely logical for it to end the wars outside, because what happens then is, when you're not operating from this like war economy, you don't have this need to compete and jockey for resources in the same way, right, that you would otherwise. You have a lot more internal power. The well-being of the people are not connected as much to aggressing on neighbors, or trying to secure resources aggressively from other places. And so that ending the war economy inside, right, is so important. And I think, people are asking me, Andrew, are you going to be a good wartime president? Yes, I actually think he's going to be, he would actually be possibly, you have to really see him in action but he could be quite a great wartime president in the sense that I believe he sees that the real war where we have to start is internal. And that kind of leadership from America, you could imagine America saying, hey, I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop running this traumatized economy. I'm going to stop, being governed by the PTSD that's been affecting my country for years and years and years. I'm going to stop and dismantle this idea that we have to keep growing GDP in this certain way. We're going to stop things like standardized testing, as well as all these other, government policies that are actually based in war. I'm going to stop doing that internal behavior. I'm going to take responsibility for myself. Now imagine that kind of role modeling would do for countries around the world. And that role modeling will inevitably decrease so much tension. And I think that is such an incredible vision that we can have. And this also includes stuff like climate change. When we are, something that I learned, I forgot what the article was, but that climate change is actually driving war because it's creating resource scarcity. And so when resource scarcity happens, the social tensions that are already there ramp up, and it causes all this aggression between people. And so I think, I don't know if Andrew clearly sees all of that, but Andrew is actually, in terms of universal basic income, human-centered economics, the people who are thinking about that kind of stuff are also the type of people who are thinking about the impact of climate change as like a military threat, and all, in AI and all this holistic thinking around how the world is working right now. And, from my perspective, he's the only candidate who it doesn't just have the moral compass. I think everybody kind of has a moral compass or tries to have one, but that's not really the thing that makes it special. He actually has, or at least has part of a vision of a whole, a vision that it's it things like climate change, how they cause military tension, or even border crisis and migration crisis. He has an understanding of how all these things can work, or are tapped into the field of people who are doing the research and the thinking around those issues, and is always willing to learn. And so I think, there's a very good case for him being a very good wartime leader, in that he's willing to dismantle the war inside. And again, the point is that the biggest war that America is facing right now is the war on normal people. And if the war on normal people doesn't end, the war on everybody else doesn't end either. So anyways, yeah, thank you for listening. That was kind of my perspective. I think, again, the big takeaway, I think, is that the war we have inside, or the constant feeling of fear and aggression that spikes in us, that inside, it always manifests outside and has a relationship, and understanding that isn't just about people, that's also about countries. So the fear that is driven inside, and the government policies that are created to drive that, and it's subtle, but it shows up as this a really fear-driven economy, all that manifests outside. So I feel Andrew is a great opportunity to learn and think about those issues. And I hope also from his side, in the campaign, that he himself continues to research and understand these things, to bring them forward clear, and send a clear message about, hey, if we really want to end this forever war, we also need to start with the war that we have going inside of the country. So, okay. Yeah, thank you for following my channel, or maybe if you're not subscribed, or, there's only 20 people subscribed at most. Maybe it's even less. But I don't know. I'm going to be making a bunch of videos here and there about this kind of stuff, and that kind of ties in Andrew Yang's campaign and psychotherapy and political movements and the broad strokes of yeah, how all those things kind of work together. So yeah, thank you for listening.